Hello, this is Michael Hexter. Welcome to Politics 2100 here on YouTube. This episode I'm calling Putin's Imperialism Exposes the Left's Ambivalence. Putin's Imperialism Exposes the Left's Ambivalence about Liberalism. So that title is maybe a little bit cryptic, and let me explain it in more detail. So we have, with the revelation or the switch of the Putin regime to a more aggressive stance vis-a-vis its neighbors, in particular Ukraine, that Russia now represents, as it's been feared to represent in the past, or at least when it was the Soviet Union, a threat to democracies in various forms, including the Ukrainian democracy, and also Western Europe more generally, a threat to them because of its possession of nuclear weapons, among other things, and also a strong military and a ruthless leader who is, a fascist, or neo-fascist, become fascist. And is apparently still relatively popular within Russia. So this event puts, among other things, the United States and also NATO and the NATO countries and the countries of Europe west of the border of, let's say, Belarus and Russia, in the situation where they need to stand up for their political system, which is based on, among other things, small L liberalism, not the American variety of what we call a political liberal. So liberalism being the political tradition that was is often traced to John Locke, where government is based on individual rights, rights to speech, rights to property, and the concept of government guaranteeing these certain rights, and also that now that system became entwined with, and also democracy. Okay, so democracy and also individual responsibility, among other things, for that can lead then to responsibility for damages that you might do to other people, responsibility for your property, and within it also are all kinds of imperfections about slavery was still practiced in Britain, and also when John Locke formulated his ideas, and I mean many liberals were against slavery, but the system grew up that is also associated with the Enlightenment, so forth and so on, and freedom of conscience, and freedom of inquiry, scientific inquiry. These are all related in a way to liberalism, and it's a challenge to earlier clericism and the medieval worldview of where the church was the ultimate authority over thinking and over knowledge, and with the church being supposedly the representative of God, and it has something to do with also Protestantism, which was rebellion against Catholicism in the Catholic Church. So anyway, now the left tradition, which includes Marx, and but particularly with Marx, and Marx being the most important philosopher in that tradition, saw itself as being now this is where there is some room, in some sense, for ambivalence or ambiguity, really, in the writing and also in the agitation, political agitation of people like Marx and people who emulated Marx in different forms, including Lenin and including the Bolsheviks, who eventually became the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and then eventually, evolved beyond that to Stalinism and then post-Stalinism, and then eventually collapse of the Soviet Union. So and within that also are the formative period of Vladimir Putin, who was a communist, and then a KGB agent, and then later he became a politician in post-Soviet Russia. So, but the main question for the left, in a way, is whether socialism and the goal of whatever the left is trying to achieve is an extension of liberalism. In other words, is it just liberalism on steroids, or is it a overturning of liberalism? Is it a contrary to liberalism, and is it illiberal or anti-liberal? And this is, again, I'm not referring to the American designation of liberalism. This is a liberalism that actually spans up the political spectrum from right to left in many countries, but not the fascist right, and also not the far left, and in a way, so the left hasn't decided, and I don't think Marx decided this in any decisive way, whether the left is trying to extend and enhance a liberal political framework to include economic rights, and therefore to, in some sense, impinge on the property rights, or not in some sense, definitely impinge on the property rights of capital holders, and particularly large capital holders, and who employ lots of people, and who then represent a class that is more advantaged in the capitalist system than the working class. So, or you could say the direct producers, and then they become the owners of the productive capacity that the producers use to create goods and services. And anyway, so whether the property rights of those people are maintained, or whether they are limited and restricted due to their negative effects on workers and negative effects on the environment overall. And so extending liberalism, in other words, so it's not an easy thing to say, well, we're just going to extend political rights and the rights to free speech and to individual self-possession and to economic rights. So then we get into areas of conflict that need to be settled through political struggle, and also then through policy decisions of a government that decides one way or the other how to structure the economic rights of different groups, and also structure the economy overall through various forms of investment in infrastructure and so forth and so on. This is not simply I don't take at face value the idea that the liberal fantasy of, or the neoliberal fantasy really, of a also liberal but not neoliberal too, of a self-founding market that isn't in some sense embedded in the society, that includes a state that is already planning on having an economy of a particular type, and is creating it from the perspective of the leaders of that government, but also heavily influenced by the ruling class, and heavily often being those government leaders being drawn from that same class. So so anyway, even if they're elected through a democratic process. So anyway, so what happens with so we have in this confrontation in Europe, in Eastern Europe, a boundary then between, let's say, an illiberal imperialist and then liberal-ish governments, including, I mean, for instance, Vladimir Zelensky has shown himself to be a consummate liberal, or at least in terms of his speech and his actions, and also neoliberal too. So and we have then here a choice then for there are people not just on the left, but there are sort of groups of people in the developing world who Putin has allied himself with, who are feeling sympathy with Putin, and they feel like they've been excluded from the party of prosperity which the Western European and North American government states have enjoyed, and they also have been under the boot of them. So another problem in the development of these liberal states with formal democracies in them is that they've had illiberal foreign policies based on economic interest of corporations, of these property holders, these organizations that own capital, and who then go out and exploit other weaknesses in other nations and labor forces and so forth and so on to and try to dictate to them their political systems and think that they can remake them in some image of in other words, what's called nation building now in a pejorative way in the United States, but at least that's one of the, or just simply just knocking off the or eliminating the local somewhat independent-minded elites and in parties, maybe of the left, maybe not, but and then installing or favoring through various covert and overt means and economic means compliant elites in those countries that don't challenge capital, the big multinational corporations or transnational corporations that are based mostly in Europe and the United States, and so and they extract resources, and so there's a clear material flow to these democracies, these quote unquote these liberal democracies. So and they have been favored, and more so than the illiberal Eastern or basically Russia and Belarus, nations who are embarking on a different route. So for the left in the West, and for the people who are having the most problem with, or who are most opposed to this, to the Ukrainian cause, for instance, are people who have accepted that Putin is a resistor to this imperialist project, that he is a independent is about national self-determination for Russia, because he's not compliant with or he complies only tactically, not across the board with the needs of Western corporations, and he runs his own system, so to speak, and it is pretty much his own system. So he is a dictator, and he has created a what was, as I was saying in the previous episode, was an autocracy, a neo-fascist autocracy, and then it's becoming, looks like a fully fascist or paleo-fascist totalitarian state. And so that creates a extremely complex set of choices for people who have been committed to the autonomy of Russia vis-a-vis the nations of the West, and also just in general, the idea is that they're for national self-determination, and for that matter, I'm for national self-determination. So, but what happens when that, and this is something that we encountered over and over again in the last 80, 90 years with the Soviet Union, and then later communist China and Vietnam and so forth and so on, that there were movements that were illiberal, okay, that were based on Marx's rejection of electoral democracy, among other things, or just, he didn't reject it, but that on the assumption that there was a bourgeois state that needed to be overthrown, and among other things, the liberal institutions that were became the basis of bourgeois democracies that need to be overthrown. And Marx left it sort of the mechanisms to do that. He left it blank, and then Lenin filled in that method through Marxism-Leninism, and which is communism, or capital C communism, and so that system is a rejection of that kind of both freedom of speech and quote unquote all these bourgeois notions about individual rights, and in favor of the idea that you represent this class, this universal class, or either peasant, worker class, and you the party, and so you're enacting their will, and it's a collective effort. It's not a individual. There's not a core or of individual rights and so forth and so on, and so in them. And so for the left in the non-communist countries, but who were like in the Vietnam War or against the Vietnam War, were trying to prevent the U.S. from continuing to oppress the Vietnamese people, and just allow them to that national liberation movement that was happened to be communist to just continue on its path. And eventually they did, and eventually they won that war. That you would be the value of non-intervention, or the value of anti-imperialism, and the value of democracy, or valuing democracy across the board, were in an uneasy relationship, and there's not a clear side. In other words, if you're supporting the communist rebels, or the guerrillas, and then eventually their government, and you're in solidarity with them, you look to one side when you see their the workings of a one-party state, and their suppression of individual rights, so especially political rights. And eventually most of these governments, the ones that still exist, have included economic rights and rights to property, as part of their systems in some form or another, because of economic development issues and harnessing people's individual initiatives and work ethics and so forth and so on, based on property rights and profit and loss and so forth and so on. So this the history of I don't have a simple solution to this, but I think one of the fundamental decisions that needs to be made, and I think we need to go back, and this is a project that I've started in a manuscript I've started writing, a critique of, among other people, Marx, and mostly Marx, or his legacy certainly in the left, to figure out whether we are trying to extend, we're not overthrowing small L liberalism, but we are intensifying, extending it, making it more democratic, and making it and also limiting. Now what does overthrowing capitalism look like? No one has really succeeded in doing that. So what is the more democratic and more sustainable economic system that we're trying to build, and more democratic, more egalitarian, that is post-capitalism? And because definitely the capitalist system, it has some benefits to it, but it's overall, on a macroeconomic level, it is unsustainable because of its endless need for growth, and also the class differentiation that comes with the capitalist system, or the income, the great inequality between classes, at least. So we need to sort of think through again these divisions that have become left and right, and also where rights, what are the good political rights that we want, how we're going to maintain those political rights and then enhance them, and the economic rights that we want, and how are we going to build those and enhance those. So to get back to Putin's imperialism, it's like, so this puts us though in a position there with this, for instance, supporting the fight of the Ukrainians versus the Russians. It's like we are then supporting basically liberal capitalist versus statist capitalist, or not even statist capitalist, but just kleptocratic, autocratic capitalists that have the legacy of a former communist dictatorship a long time ago, or 30, 40 years ago. So but they're no longer that. Okay, so I don't consider them to be a left alternative to the Ukrainian, what's developed in Ukraine in terms of an economy, or for that matter in the European Union. So the European Union is a project that has many, and for that matter the North American political economy is all similarly is very problematic. It's great, very, very extractive, very treats again the less developed countries as siphons off their wealth, and or has unequal exchange with them, leaves them with very little means to develop themselves and to grow their own sustainable economies, and sees them as points of extracting natural resources and so forth and so on, or cheap labor, or source of cheap labor. So so it's not an ideal system, but is it better than the Russian system? What Russia certainly has? Yeah, I would say yes. Okay, so it is marginally better. So it's the difference between bad and worse, which is something I've talked about in other episodes here on Politics 2100. That its badness, there are some goods in its badness, and some of those goods are things that allow me and allow people in Europe, in Western Europe and in Central Europe, to talk like I'm talking with relative freedom about what we think, and certainly, and even to act with relative freedom, to do certain anti-government and anti-state things without being thrown in jail for many, many years. And now again, that needs to be, that's not something that's written in stone. It could be changed. It could be, these things are, depends on who you're resisting. And, you know, political rights are always things that need to be fought for and maintained. But the knee-jerk dismissal of quote-unquote NATO and the European Union, and the European Union, there are many problems with the European Union. Its fiscal structure, I mean, I'm from the modern money theory tradition in economics, and the European Union has developed into a very, very problematic economy because of the way the European Central Bank, at least the Eurozone part of it, has lamed the fiscal policy of different governments, and has created, doesn't have any mechanisms to rebalance the imbalances in trade within the European Union. So because of erroneous ideas about money, hard money fantasies, basically. And I will do an episode soon about the embargo of Russian oil requires that the ECB, the European Central Bank, loosen and get rid of its stupid deficit rules, and also invest in a Green New Deal for Europe in order to free Europe from its dependence on, you know, external fossil energy sources, and also its own fossil energy sources too. There is some coal in Germany, among other places, Poland, and so. But anyway, to free it from fossil energy overall, and particularly from, obviously right now, from Russia. So anyway, so the standard categories of the left need to be rethought based on what's bad and what's worse. Okay, and there's been a non-recognition of the worse, of the autocratic and retrograde parts of the Putinist system, and that inherits things from the Yeltsinist system. It's not like Putin invented these things. It doesn't come only from Putin. This is part of the incomplete social and political and economic development of Russia, partly because of Tsarism, or definitely because of Tsarism, and because of and then communism, and then Yeltsin, and then Putin. So really a combination of all these different systems that Russians have lived under, that have created a problem for them in terms of social development overall, and lead them to, you know, depend on leaders like Putin to give them a sense of national purpose, among other things. So and sense of autonomy, and so forth and so on. And so anyway, so I think the bad system, or the slightly better system of the NATO countries and of the European Union, can't necessarily go lecturing and modeling societies on them entirely, but they are also their aspects of things that they do that are, you know, really better than most governments in the world in some way or another. So there's a mixture of different positives and negatives in it. So so I'm not, this is not a matter of taking good and evil and finding one is good and one is evil, but we certainly have bad and what looks like actually pretty evil, but in the part of Putin, and very much evil in the part of Putin and what he's doing. But still, that doesn't mean that you are good if he is very evil. And so, so proceed with caution is my suggestion. So anyway, so I think I'm going to be returning to this theme in different forms, but it just has occurred to me that this long-standing ambivalence about liberalism and about the individual rights that are part of the system that many people have grown up with in the richer countries and the more developed countries, that some of those things are worth maintaining, and some of them are things that you don't want to throw out, even if as you want to radically improve our societies, and also not cave to a worse system that is trying to do some damage in Eastern Europe right now. So anyway, so if you have any thoughts about this theme, please share in the comments below. If you think this was an interesting presentation, please like the video. And also, if you're just generally getting things out of Politics 2100, please subscribe. And I will see you in the next video.